Welcome to the Contemporary South Asia podcast, the audio companion to the journal Contemporary South Asia, published by Taylor and Francis. Each episode, we engage with scholarship that examines the politics, societies, and cultures of South Asia in their global and historical contexts. Through conversations with authors and experts, we highlight key debates, emerging research, and critical perspectives that shape understandings of the region today. Our aim is to extend the dialogue beyond the page, opening the journal's work to a wider audience of scholars, students, and interested listeners. My name's Dr. Thomas Chambers. I'm an Associate Professor of Social Anthropology at Oxford Brookes University. In this episode, we're very pleased to welcome Dr. Bharti Arora. Bharti is an Assistant Professor of English at the Department of English, University of Delhi. She's also been awarded the AIAS AUFF Fellowship 2024 by the Aarhus Institute of Advanced Studies at Aarhus University. She was the Charles Wallace India Trust Fellow in 2022 at the Institute of Advanced Studies in the Humanities in the University of Edinburgh. And she's the author of Right in Gender, Right in Nation, Women's Fiction in Post-Independence India. The focus of today's podcast, though, is on her recent special section that was published in Contemporary South Asia in January 2025, titled Decolonial Praxis of Solidarity in Indian Literary and Cultural Discourses on Social Movements. Hi, Bharti. Welcome to the Contemporary South Asia podcast. We're very pleased to have you here.
Oh, thank you so much, Tom. The pleasure is all mine. Thank you.
This is our first podcast, of course, so it's for us it's a really sort of a bit of an event as well, and we're really glad to be opening with your work in this particular session. The podcast that we're sort of going to be going through today is focusing on, of course, on the special section that you've had in the most recent issue of Contemporary South Asia, which for listeners is volume 33, issue 1, published in March 2025. And you have a wonderful special section in here called Decolonial Praxis or Praxises of Solidarity in Indian Literary and Cultural Discourses on Social Movements. Bharti, I wonder if you could just start by telling us a little bit about, this special section. What's the kind of narrative frame that you're working with here?
Right. Thank you. I got the Charles Wallace Fellowship in 2022 at the University of Edinburgh, and it was there that I conceptualized this topic because I had to apply for the Susan Manning workshop grant. And I eventually did get the grant. And it was during that time that I got in touch with the former editor of the journal, Dr. John Zavos. And this is where we conceptualized it. And after I successfully organized the workshop, I thought of turning it into a special issue or special section. Now, this is something which is very close to my heart, as I have been working on a research project that probes the cognitive impact of fiction, and how narratives have this ability of bringing people together. And this is where I also try to redefine how social movements or revolutions happen. Revolutions, conventionally in the social sciences contexts, revolutions have, been conceptualized, defined as, of course, those that are built on insurgent citizenships, right? And specifically those that happen on the ground. But then I also wanted to probe the role of literature and literary narratives, what they could do in terms of building solidarities, in terms of building affective connections, and intersubjective transformations amongst people. So this is how I reached out to contributors asking them if they could think of any literary narratives that have dealt with the social movements and how they see these narratives acting as creative reinterpretations of the idea of the insurgent or the activist citizen, so to say.
Fantastic. Yes. I mean, it's such an interesting kind of area to be thinking about and does allow us to, kind of stretch beyond, as you say, a sort of, an on the ground sort of approach. I suppose, to connect really with, the ways in which imaginaries of, sort of possibilities and the potential futures are sort of forged. You talked there about sort of, literature, of course. Could you, for a read, for a listener here who's perhaps not sort of, too familiar with the context, could you tell us a bit about, I mean, this is in a bit about the sort of literature, the languages that are in the literature,
Right.
the specific types of literature. I mean, are we talking here about kind of high culture literature, or are we also thinking about various other forms of literature that might come into play?
Right. So, I was primarily interested in social realism specifically. And in fact, apart from Ritu Madan, who has engaged with Anis Kidwai's memoirs, no, Azadi Ki Chhaw Mein or In Freedom's Shade, all the other papers deal with narratives, literary narratives, as in fiction and so on and so forth. So this is something which I thought could offer, and as I have also mentioned, they could offer aesthetic reconstitution of how we imagine the world around us. Now, I was also recently, engaging with Gyanendra Pandey's work titled Unarchived Histories, The Mad and the Trifling, and where he goes on to argue that archives, when you specifically look at archives, and there is an element of selection and inclusion that goes into how we operate with the archive. However, he says, that the common sense, and I'm quoting him here, the common sense is articulated in rarely archived, historically unpretty, and therefore generally unacknowledged actions and statements. This provided me the cue to, seriously engage with literary writings, because I believe that fiction then, provides us with that kind of an unconventional or a subterranean archive. Um, that captures how the everyday routine violence, the everyday routine discriminations take place against people, and how it is so important to uh, engage with these everyday discriminations, right? And uh, how does fiction play a role there? So of course I spoke a bit about the fact that fiction activates cognition, right? So, you know, uh, we also need to rethink ways in which fiction or reading, has been hitherto conceptualized as the activity, as a leisurely activity, so to say, as something which involves the solitary reader, so to say, and how, therefore it is divorced from the larger contexts of society, or literature at best can mirror what's happening in society. Now, if we start looking at, these different ways in which narratives get theorized, and in fact I moving on, I also mention about, the potential of making, imagining communities, so again, as against the imagined communities that are exclusive, that are, attached to the notion of territorial boundaries and sovereign nation states. We have this radical potential unleashed by literature, where it enables you through cognitively reaching out to other worlds, other people, their social imaginaries, their emotional imaginaries. So this is where the radical role of imagination gets unleashed and enables us to see how the how people undergo these changes in their interiority, right? And in fact, this is the very base on which social movements that happen on the ground are also contingent, right? Why do people come together? Something happens within them, right? So there is there's a transformation in terms of their interiority, which motivates them to perceive the cause of the other as not simply the cause of the other, but uh, see how the cause of the other is able to usher in transformations within myself, as a human being, as a citizen. And this is where I believe, literary narratives play that kind of a role. They enable us to forge these solidarities via the radical potential of imagination. I hope I responded
Yeah,
to the
Bharti, I mean, this is
question.
wonderfully sort of detailed. Thank you so much. I'm wondering then, about this sort of, because obviously you brought together a few different papers here, and
Right.
for again, kind of thinking about, a listening audience here, if you maybe it'd be helpful sort of just go through, some of the papers a little bit. So perhaps it makes sense to start with your own paper, Bharti, which was, can there be a decolonial practice of solidarity,
Right.
structural
Right.
violence, mobilization in social movements? But before I do so, could you just give us a little bit of a sense, just in very simple terms, for the listener, a sense of the kind of geographical and temporal context that the articles are dealing with here? So obviously we're dealing with both the sort of post-colonial. Are we also looking at the colonial era literature? But also in terms of geographical terms, are we dealing here primarily with literature from India only, or are we spreading out a bit more into South Asia? The languages and the literature that you're examining here, these kinds of things, just to sort of give a little bit of a sense of the landscape that you're looking at.
Right. So I begin by talking about my own article here. Right. So, so my article titled "Can There Be a Decolonial Praxis of Solidarity, Structural Violence and Mobilization Social Movement?" It rereads Kashinath Singh's novel Personal Front that was published in 1985, and Alka Saraogi's novel Jankidas Tejpal Mansion that was published in 2016. And it probes if and how, cognitive, volitional, and intersubjective relationships can be forged among people. Now, this is very interesting because I remember when I submitted this paper, the very first response that I received from the peer reviewers was that, why do you want to bring these two novels together? Something that was published in 1985 that deals with the linguistic politics of India in 1960s, specifically the agitations that were taking place in favor of Hindi language and against English. And on the other hand, something else that was published into 2016 that is very directly engaging with the post-liberalized Indian state. Now, and this, in fact, got me into a very serious thinking mode. And I, also, my first reason was that Alka Saraogi, even as she engages with the post-liberalization context of India and how the average citizen has been so complicitly incorporated, co-opted by the corrupt structures of the state, and the structural violence, of course, that follows from therein. But what was more important for me was that she also goes back to the 1970s, when the Naxalite movement was at its peak, against this was the movement wherein the left movements cadre, it was actively involved with the peasants' rights in India. Now, uh, and this is something which was very interesting because, uh, you know, I thought that, on the one hand, we have this narrative by Kashinath Singh, which was produced from the immediacy of the 1960s, right? And on the other hand, I have this novel that is trying to go back to the 1960s, 1970s, and uh, trying to figure out how that failed attempts at solidarities at that point in time have shaped the nation as we are inhabiting it today. And this was so interesting because, and then in the meantime, I also came across Anne Rigney's excellent formulation of memory activism, that how, the each of these social movements which have taken place, how, they go back to the ones that came before them, And this is how they form a chain of activism. So this is how they are also engaged with each other in terms of the politics of hope, and the politics of anger. That how the previous movements were, when they were unable to, um uh, even as they conceptualized an egalitarian world, and they were unable to materialize it, right, due to whatever reasons, um, how the subsequent movement bases itself upon that disappointment or the success of the previous movement, and moves on with its vision of an egalitarian future. And this is what is so important for me as a scholar to engage with, because when we 2025, when we are living in this postmodernist, post liberalized context, and I know, as even as Walter Minolo talks about the fact that we are living in the midst of the colonial matrix of power, where we are being offered only two options: either to delink, and delink again, delink from whom, from what, right? Because such attempts at delinking, um, even as they have been theorized quite effectively in the Latin American context, but the moment we try to go back to, or engage with, say for instance, a South Asian context, we realize that the ascriptive hierarchies that have always been embedded in the structure of the communities, uh, and then the colonial state, and then the post independent state, there can be no past to go back to. There can be no there can be no delinking with the present that can happen at the cost of building a glorified past, so to say, right? Or building a past that was systemically corrupted by the colonial state, right? So if you look at the context of South Asia, also Africa to an extent, there were these ascriptive hierarchies. This is something that I'm borrowing from Aloysius's work, nationalism without nation without nationalism in India. So this is something which really made me conscious about the need to seek alternative frames of reference for solidarity, right? And what could be those moments. And you look at the Naxalite movement, why did it fail? Because the middle class intelligentsia failed to connect with the concerns of the peasants. For them, for the left movement of the times, this was only about um, you know ob- uh, considering the farmers as an object of the movement, right? There was no attempt at learning from their traditional wisdom and community wisdom, so to say. They were simply considered as objects who could be tutored into the leftist ideology, so to say. And this is where it becomes so important, therefore, to step back, pause, and engage with how, every time one talks about ideological movements, it is also equally important to probe where they failed, in order to build again, ways of imagining and recreatively reimagining our future. So this was what my paper was all about. And shall I also go on to?
Yeah, I'll maybe come to the others in a
Okay,
moment, if that's
right.
okay. Because there's a few things that I thought were really fascinating there, and I mean, just for anyone who's listening here who perhaps isn't familiar with the Naxalite kind of insurgencies in India, we're talking about a kind of a Maoist-rooted kind of movement, active really across quite broad areas of sort of northeast India, particularly from the 1960s onwards, but primarily in kind of Andhra Pradesh, Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, these kinds of regions of the country.
Yes.
And but obviously this is a very particular movement with its own very particular history, and I was quite struck by your mention, of course, the ways in which kind of a middle class intelligentsia perhaps impose a particular idea of what emancipation, I suppose, should look like upon the peasantry. And and of course we have still this more recently, in very recent years, really, this sort of turning of the lens, I suppose, by the state onto
Yes.
the left wing intelligentsia through this label of urban Naxal and so on and so on. But this is its a very sort of particular sort of case, and you hinted there, of course, at some connections, in terms of thinking about this across geographical space, and particularly with your mention, of course, of the South or Latin American context, where there's clearly quite a lot of paralleling and that could be kind of done there. So I just wonder if you could just touch a little bit on how how your the sort of specific context you're examining here in terms of that kind of literary kind of cultivation of the imagination, also perhaps speaks to other geographical contexts elsewhere in the world.
Right. So, in fact, I had initially planned this special section to, engage with the South Asian context. But then, because of logistical reasons, we had to bring it down to the Indian context. And in fact, I still remember when I organized the workshop, we had dealt with the South Asian context. And this is something which I do talk about in my introduction a bit. So, in fact, if you look at the case of, say, for instance, Sri Lanka or Pakistan, or even, for instance, what has lately happened in Bangladesh, uh, this is something, which has uh, repeatedly brought us to question the structure of social movements, right? So, for instance, when I spoke about the context of Pakistan in my introduction, I specifically focused on the revolutionary movement during the year 1968, when there were, the disparate sections of society in Pakistan were, they launched a collective struggle against the military regime of Ayub Khan, and then how the networks of solidarities were extended to them in Britain, as the students and the workers associations, they got together. Now, of course, and these were moments of again, insurgent uh, solidarities, right? These are very interesting phenomenon uh, for me, because in I no and I have also taught about different kinds of revolutions, to my students. For instance, when, if I can, go back into the past, the 17th century, and I teach Milton, Paradise Lost. Very interesting. Milton's take on the British Revolution is so interesting. And this is what I tell them every time, that what is Milton doing here? It's not simply about, and of course, the reading of Paradise Lost has been dominated by the romantic moment, right? Said that Milton was of the devil's party without knowing that, and this, and as very popularly said by Blake. But then what I ask them to do is, see what is he doing there? This is written after the revolution. This is done when, the this after 1660, right? And he is trying to figure out where do where do they stand, so to say? Where do these erstwhile revolutionaries stand, so to say? Vis-a-vis the idea of revolution, and and the idea of religion is also so deeply enmeshed with, the how uh, how Eve's resistance, how Eve's revolution spans out in the text, right? Now, um, and it becomes so interesting that for each of these sections, either the royalists or the republicans, God becomes a very central figure, that how, even as eventually, of course, the restoration of monarchy does happen and all of that. And both the groups are figuring it out, if God was on their side, right? And this is what I tell them, that, this is how you need to figure out. And of course, the French Revolution, then why does it happen all the time? In fact, most of the times, that when these movements happen with this vision to transform the world, to bring in egalitarian structures, where they connect with this innate desire in human beings to live freely, to live with liberty. Why do these revolutions tend to lapse into that same systemic structure of violence that they had uh, aimed to contest and challenge in the first place? Why are they not able to provide us, to offer an alternative framework, you know, uh, of rebuilding so the social collectivities? And this is something, why I also thought that maybe literature can provide us with responses, that revolutions happen when people undergo changes, in their uh, mm, in their the core of their interiority, and not necessarily when you topple down structures. And this is what also brings us to an added context, that how important it is to view the structures, the dominant structures, from below. Only when you're able to view the dominant structures from below, you will not be blinded by or colored by the context of privileges that surround us.
Thank you so much, Bharti. Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating stuff. I'm just curious, well, then, to sort of, think a little bit about some of the other articles that you brought together in the special section, because, of course, there's this wonderful narrative, kind of that flows through the section as a whole. So you sort of open with Ritu Madan's piece of Saintly Men and Wanton Girls, The Social Worker's Adventures in the Refugee City, a wonderful title. I wonder if you could tell us just a little bit, to give a little sense of that particular piece.
Sure. So this is one of my favorite articles, because specifically it deals with two very significant aspects. The first is, again, the role of the social worker, right? The social worker in the post-independence city. And usually, the role of the women as social workers was perceived as, defined by the context of seva, again, charity, But then here, seva becomes a political tool. It enables the social worker to redefine her own identity as a woman. Next, it also very beautifully engages with the figure of the refugee woman, and why does
just for sort of the listener here, the refugee woman in this particular context, who is the refugee woman in this particular context?
Yeah. Right. So people, specifically women who were in fact, when we go back to the partition of India, we see how women became the sites of communal honor, right? Stigma, shame, and these women were kidnapped. These women were raped across communities and across the newly formed nation states. And when both the states launched the central recovery operations, and these women were brought back, they were unfortunately not accepted by their own families and communities, because they had become impure, and the state had to live up to the role of the parents patriae state, and offer shelter and refuge to these women. And of course, there were these other women who came along with their families, but yet they were condemned to a very deprived existence. And here, the Ritu Madan uh, effectively breaks those hierarchies between the woman as a social worker and the woman as a refugee, where the woman as a social worker realizes, she learns a lot from the refugee woman, and when there is this one particular instance where there is this family of these refugees, where women are they don't have enough space, so they have to wash themselves, take a bath again under the street tap, and the neighborhood is complaining about it, that these women have no shame. And then these refugee women say that that but then where do we go, so the nakedness that for the society is a mark of shame and stigma, for them it's a marker of their material deprivation, that they have been reduced to, that there is no shame in this nakedness. In fact, if anyone has to feel ashamed, it's the state, it's the larger community that that does not realize how these women who have now been returned to their so-called state, with a lot of alacrity and enthusiasm, how their rights to the state have been compromised.
And how then, because obviously I'm conscious that the hero section here sort of deals with both the literary and the cultural sort of discourse.
Right, right.
But how does, how do those sorts of discourses, and I mean, you've outlined sort of certainly the cultural discourse. Is there sort of a literary discourse present in this particular piece as well?
In Ritu Madan's piece? Yes. So of course, she engages with Anis Kidwai's narrative, in Freedom's Shade, and so this is also very interesting because this is based on the experiences, the again the autobiographical experiences of the social worker who comes in contact of Gandhi, and specifically, even as she and her family, her husband, were involved in the nationalist movement, but then partition really, marks a kind of a break. In fact, Anis Kidwai, as again going back to what Ritu is arguing in the paper, Anis Kidwai very clearly mentions that this sense of alienation, from the city of Delhi, where most of the Muslims were either, forced to go to camps, located in the old fort, or again, they left India for Pakistan. So this was a very crucial moment where the Muslim community came under duress, either to prove their loyalty and stay back in India, or again, look for uh, maybe envision a new future for themselves, right? And based on so many insecurities, that were the result of those times. And so this is where the paper also engages with the cultural context of the times, that how at a time when both the communities should have withstood the pressures of this significant moment, they broke apart. In fact, if I'm really moved by also, uh, uh, Gandhi, and this specifically this work called Gandhi, the this the I think it's by Satish Deshpande, I think, the impossible possibility, Gandhi. And he, when the entire nation was celebrating its independence, Gandhi was in Noakhali offering refuge and succor to Muslims, and trying to put an end to the communal hostility that had engulfed the state and people at that point in time. And therefore, therefore it becomes so important for us to go back to these fragile moments where people, uh, uh, despite the uh, the wide scale violence, hostility that surrounded them, they chose to listen to their hearts. They chose to reach out to people in crisis, and they chose to and when they offered refuge to them, that was not out of any obligation, so to say, right? That was simply because they had experienced those kinds of fundamental changes in their interiority, which told them that at this particular moment it is so significant to hold the fabric of the community and the state nation together. Because nation, and if I can again go back to a very beautiful line by Rabindranath Tagore in his novel Home in the World. He says that nation is you and I, nation is people, nation is not this dominant authoritarian structure out there, that can only establish its relationship with its citizens in either in terms of authoritarianism or in terms of welfarist drives, right? So therefore, this, and in fact, Nehru did have that vision, that how the state and the citizens are equally responsible towards each other. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's really fascinating because I mean, I suppose here as well, then, we're thinking, not just about, intersubjective or individual imaginaries and activities, but also, the ways in which, a state is imagined and forged and shaped. And, I find myself reflecting on, in the context of my own research, which is primarily focused in Uttar Pradesh.
Yes.
A couple of years ago, I was reading, sort of the speeches of Maulana Hussain, who was the Deoband seminary, and he gave these sort of speeches, very much, as part of that kind of Congress narrative of composite nationalism and so on and so on. But it had a profound effect on, on Muslims in that region, and very much the appeal was that there was stay and be a part of this, of this kind of future, rather than, I suppose an ethno-nationalist kind of, position that, present, across communities at the time.
Yeah.
And again, these sorts of things really, are woven into all sorts of discourses, as you say, whether that be literary or cultural or so on, and it's wonderful to see them kind of teased out. But moving on to sort of some of the other texts here then as well, because we have these sort of interesting segues as well. I mean, Someshwar Sathi's piece, for example, The Form Bodies and the Decolonial Turn, Unthinking and Rethinking the Colonial Episteme in Animals People, sorry.
You're right.
For people who aren't familiar with Animals People, could you just start by telling us a little bit about that, and then sort of, perhaps we can sort of, broaden that out a little bit.
Sure. So, Animals People is written by Indira Sinha, and it goes back to the 1984 Bhopal gas disaster, where and it left people maimed and deformed and disabled for life. And this was one of those very first instances. This is still 1984. The state has not officially opened its doors to the capitalist and liberalized structures of the world. And this is the first setback that one experiences, and how the state actively colludes with these capitalist structures and works against its own citizens, right? And this is something which Sati has also brilliantly taken up when he brings in disability theories and questions the entire premise at which one, based on which one defines who is human, who is disabled, right? And this is what I really appreciate about his contribution, that and we do talk about human rights, right? But then uh, uh, as we also see in the case of Animals People, what if, and this character animal, he categorically asserts that he does not want to embrace the identity of human, right? He embraces the identity of animal. And this is also something interesting, because when we uh, put in a lot of thrust on human rights, somehow we also privilege the anthropomorphic contexts of our lives. We do not really understand how the human life is so deeply entwined with the larger epistemes, that surround us, the living beings, so to say. And then Animals People very effectively breaks down these hierarchies, right? So, of course, he goes on to problematize this aspect of gaze, the gaze that uh, diminishes a disabled person, you know um, and in fact, this is also the same gaze which um, structures the attitude of the nation states towards its disabled citizens, right? That they are not active contributors to the national economy, but they are only recipients of welfare and charity. that they have nothing to contribute to the state. And this is something that Sati uh, argues against, and he locates the neo-colonial and the liberal state within the colonial matrix of power, and argues that how, it is so important to contest this kind of partial knowledge, which is deeply rooted in the Eurocentric notions of human rights, so to say.
And I guess in the novel, I mean, we have this American doctor, right, who
Yes,
features quite
yes,
substantially there, and I guess provides both an intervention, but also to a degree that kind of gaze, I suppose, in terms of the narrative.
yes,
We talk a little bit about that. So I mean, this
yes,
novel rather than the article per se, but obviously, it's sort of thought about there as well.
yes, certainly. Yeah.
So if we move on then to the final piece in the special section, which is Harris Kabir's piece, excuse me, subalternity and everyday solidarity in contemporary Indian short stories. And here we really are, very much coming into the contemporary context, but in a way, I suppose, it kind of brings us full circle as well, because here we're coming back to where we began with that, kind of question of communal tension. In this case, again, very specifically, kind of Hindu-Muslim, communal tensions, and the ways in which short stories in this case, rather than kind of highbrow literature or something like this, is really kind of bringing together a kind of a discourse, a narrative, or that sort of imaginary, I suppose, of understanding, I guess. I wouldn't go as far as communal harmony. That's perhaps a bit far, I think. But certainly of kind of appreciation and understanding, conviviality, perhaps even. And I wonder if you could then, tell us a little bit about.
Yes. Right. So he, again, Harris's paper is also very close to my heart. In fact, he is my colleague at the University of Delhi. And even when he was writing this paper, we would engage in very detailed conversations about how, one needs to really, structure this paper. And um, so he speaks about, the everyday solidarities in terms of, affective relations across the Muslim and Dalit communities, and also the dietary solidarity, right? In fact, and this becomes so important because I remember, if you go back to the, for instance, these, works by uh, writers like Ritu Menon, Kamla Bhasin, and Urvashi Butalia, who wrote works like Borders and Boundaries, and the other side of silence, when it came to taking stock of the partition after 50 years of Indian independence, and and survivors of partition. I still remember Ritu Menon talking about one of these survivors who quotes that that uh, roti beti ka rishta nahi tha, baki sab tha. So they were, of course, they would not break bread together. They would not intermarry, in their communities. But then otherwise, everything was okay. And Kadir's paper offers a very strong, follow up to that. That how, and in fact, also these are the only two ways intercommunal dining. In fact, B.R. Ambedkar also mentioned that this was one of the ways in which one could contest the caste hegemonies in India, that how they are so fundamental to building affective solidarities, right? And Kadir gives very detailed instances from Hansada Sovendra Shekhar's work, also the Adivasi Will Not Dance, that how there are these characters who find who face so much difficulty in finding their home, or eating what they want to eat, and and how therefore the clandestine act of eating itself becomes a revolutionary act, right? And these are uh, they also become interesting because then the his paper focuses on how it is so important to perceive Dalits and Muslims not as outside or excesses to the state, but as insurgent citizens. And in fact, this is something which, and in fact, he refers to another article by Priya Kumar. And I also appreciate that kind of insight where, Muslims have been perceived as either outsiders, right? Or at best, subordinated citizens. Okay. So, and therefore it becomes so important to challenge the kind of an imaginary, the nationalist imaginary that was caste based, that was also at several instances in the past majoritarian, and no exclusively nationalist, at uh, the cost of Dalits, Muslims, Adivasis, right? And then again, it ties up with how I started my uh, defense of this special section, uh, that citizenship is not something which is imposed from above. Citizenship is not something, which the state obliges you with. Citizenship is a creative act. In fact, it's only when we struggle for our rights, we claim that citizenship. So it's not the top down approach, via which citizenship comes to us. It's the, it comes from below, when people actively struggle vis-a-vis the state, and also alter the state's conceptualization of itself, and that is more important.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, again, so much richness in right through this section, and as for someone, anyone not familiar with the kind of the Indian or even the broader sort of South Asian context, that connection to dietary solidarities is so important because food figures so profoundly, and what one consumes in terms of dietary habits configured so profoundly in terms of identity, in terms of communal identity, in terms of religious identity, in terms of caste identity, and is very vivid across marking out differences. But you also get these amazing moments. Often when I'm in UP, I work quite a lot in a city called Saharanpur, and
Yes.
there's a big pilgrimage comes through the Kanwa Yatra, and the Muslim restaurateurs and the mosques, they come out and they provide food on the roadside, and it's these wonderful moments of and obviously the food, of course, is catered towards is catered for, freely given to Hindu pilgrims. So it's not Muslim food. It's not Muslim. It's not meat, obviously, of any sort. It's
No.
It's pure veg. It's catered in that particular way, and it creates just these little sort of wonderful moments of solidarity, right? Around a little food stall at the side of the road, and all these sorts of things. Yeah, we working in that sort of context sees, right? If we're sort of
Yes.
embedded in an everyday.
Yes.
world.
Yes. That's a brilliant observation, Tom. I really appreciate your
Yeah.
insights. Yes.
Bharti, this has been a wonderfully sort of descriptive account of what's a very special special section. And for me, I have to say a particularly special section because as a recently appointed editor of the journal, this is, of course, the first special section that I've brought to publication. So it's really, really been an absolute pleasure to have you on the Contemporary South Asia podcast. Bharti Arora, thank you ever so much.
Thank you so much, Tom. Thank you for having me over. Thank you.